Hey, what's up, YouTube? It's Logan, one metalhead who says shit. And tonight, I want to talk about a specific subject. This is inspired by a recent stream on the Heavy Metallurgy channel with Kellen from Killing for Company and Jason from Eihwaz Recordings. But they essentially were highlighting their favorite albums from the year 2009. And I know it was Kellen who pitched the idea for it. I think one of the main reasons he pitched it as like the idea for the stream was to discuss like a year in music which is not necessarily discussed within the context of naming classic albums and trying to figure out like how many potential like albums would you consider to be classics from that year. You know, like too often I think in this scene we idolize years from a certain decade, the fucking 1980s. It's like all we talk about is 80, 82 to 86 or 83 or fucking 89. And then it's great when we talk about the 90s, but then it's always like, oh, it's 91 to 93, And there's a lot of decades and years that I think are skipped. And metal is such a old yet new genre that in order to keep it new, we have to revitalize it, meaning, and I mean this has been going on, this is going on without conversations like this, but we have to revitalize it, meaning that we potentially should just talk about albums from, the recent decade that we think might end up being classics, either in our eyes or in the eyes of the scene. So this is probably going to be a multiple part series where I kind of created a giant list, if you will, of albums that I think will become classics in the coming years and the coming decades of the scene. And I just kind of want to like sow these seeds, if you will, of what albums I view the scene will kind of carry on and hold on to, and maybe it'll start a conversation. I don't know. I mean, this is really meant to be a conversation because, as I said, it's not about what one person, me, thinks. It's about what the whole scene thinks, and that takes years for the scene to kind of get behind certain concepts and ideas. Like as the metal scene and as metalheads, we are not necessarily with it. I think we're so focused on past releases, which is a good thing. I mean, I think it's a good thing. But because of that, it takes longer for us to be won over by certain musical ideas and by certain, musical genres and albums. So I kind of want this video and any subsequent videos that anyone would like to add, because I would appreciate additional input on this, concept. I would like for this to be an open forum about what releases do you think the scene as a whole will view as classics moving forward from 2010 to 2019. First, to get the usual shit out of the way, in the background we're jamming one of my favorite drone Earth And bees made honey in the lion's skull. It's so chill. Drinking wise, I'm keeping it simple because it's late on a Saturday. Fucking Narragansett. I don't know that's how you say it or not. From the fucking south, so that's how I say it, Narragansett. Cheers. Alright, so as I said, there's going to be multiple videos that I want to make about this subject because this is something that I kind of hold near and dear to my heart. I got into listening to music, like, kind of period, in 2009. Like, that's when I first really started collecting physical media and buying CDs and stuff. And it was mainly into, like, hard rock and grunge and, you know, classic rock and shit like that. And then I really got into, like, listening to metal and actually diving into metal in, like, 2011. And I wouldn't say I fully dove into extreme metal music until probably about 2013. Essentially, because of this, my view of the metal scene as a whole is skewed because the albums that I first discovered from like 2012, 2013, 2014, the first couple years are huge to me. Like, those are my classics. Those are my, you know, send shivers down my spine every time I hear it. You know, those are my albums where I can't believe that people were recording music like this. Like, it blew my mind. You have to understand, I was a musically deprived kid growing up, and my whole childhood, I wanted something that I didn't even know and didn't even understand, and it wasn't until like that era of metal hit me that I knew that was it. That's what I wanted to hear and what I wanted to surround my life with, and what I wanted to use to kind of attach my identity to, you know? So this era of metal music is extremely important to me, you know? And I think it deserves to be chronicled just like, you know, the 1980s and the 1990s. And I just think it takes conversations like this to start that process, because as far as I'm concerned, you know, it seems like the general consensus for when something becomes a classic is about 7 to 10 years, you know? So, from my perspective, like 7 years ago was, you know, 2016. I think we can start to, you know, theorize with our scientist brains, theorize what albums from the decade of, you know, 2011, 2010 to 2019 are going to end up being classics. So, as I said, I'm going to make multiple videos about this because I have a shit ton of albums I would like to talk about. But I want to do like 4 per video because otherwise it'd be too damn long. So, with this first video, I'm really just trying to introduce the concept of thinking about like what makes an album a classic, you know? So, to me, there's like probably 3 different points. The first is the collective scene as a whole, right? Like, how did the collective scene feel about it right when it came out? How has the collective scene responded to it, like, directly from its release? And how many bands have been almost directly influenced by it since its release? And this first video, I kind of want to focus more on that. So, these albums are not necessarily ones that I personally view as like masterpieces. I think they will be seen as classics, and I will still tout them as classics, but, you know, they're not like perfect or even like 9 out of 10 records for the most part. They're just ones that when they came out, you fucking heard about it. Like, the scene as a whole from, like the Revolver magazines all the way down to your, you know, more harsh underground critic kind of acknowledged the fact that these were great albums. And I think this is the place to start, because I think whenever the conversation will be first had about like, oh, what great metal albums were, came out in the 2010s, it will be about these albums right here. These ones that were obviously impressive right when they came out to the metal masses, to the year-end listers, to the magazines, to the noobs, to everyone, So I'm going to start off with probably one of the more obvious picks of all obvious picks. I mean, fucking The Satanist by Behemoth. This album right here, I remember when it came out, I was floored. And I'm not necessarily a Behemoth fan. Like, this is really the only album from them that I actually enjoy. I've tried before and I've tried after this album, and none of it has clicked with me. But something about this one really did. And I think it hit the way that it did for the scene because of the story behind it. Nurgle just fought, I believe, bone cancer, it was. And then he was all embroiled in like a civil suit in Poland because of, blasphemy, which, of course, us metalheads, we eat that shit up. I mean, down with the church and stuff, I guess. But so that was the background, and then the music on this album itself is extremely well produced and perfectly balanced. The album itself is paced perfectly. There's a wide gambit of different tones and intensities on the album. It's extreme but not extreme at the same time. And the songwriting kind of contains a little bit for everyone. I mean, Blow Your Trumpets, Gabrielle is just a slow burning, vicious opening track. Messe Noir is actually my favorite song on the album. It's track number 3. One of the best guitar solos, I think, of that decade was on that song. Ora Pro Nobis Lucifer, probably one of the catchiest tracks of that decade. And then, of course, you have the closing song, O Father, O Satan, O Son, which, that song gives me chills whenever I hear it. I mean, and yeah, that song is in a league of its own, and it makes the album a cohesive piece that ties together with what Nurgle was experiencing and the band was experiencing. And I think it was really an album that the metal community needed at the time. So I think people will talk about the Satanist for years to come. Alright, so the second album I want to talk about is big for a couple reasons. I mean, it really made a landmark right when it came out. I mean, this is Nightmare Logic by Power Trip. Their sophomore effort, and it just blew the doors wide open on this kind of hardcore thrash scene. And I think it really helped to influence a death metal and hardcore scene as well. There's so much bleed over currently between hardcore and thrash and death metal. I think you can kind of trace it back a little bit to Power Trip, and a little bit back to, or a lot back to Nightmare Logic. And I love this album. I mean, this is like a mix between that crossover thrash that they were doing on Manifest Decimation, their debut, mixed with groove metal from their home state of Texas, man. I mean, I definitely get some Pantera-isms on here, but these songs are just epic, and I think will be talked about for decades. I mean, the opening track, Soul Sacrifice, probably my favorite song on the album. What a fucking riff to open it up. Executioner's Tax, Swing of the Axe. That's going to be on everyone's, best of 2010s playlist for sure. The title track is killer. If not Us, Then Who is a really underrated song off his album. And then Crucifixation is killer too. And I think the untimely passing of Riley Gale will potentially paint this in a light as well, as an album that needs to be remembered. And I definitely don't mean that as like, oh, it's only big because, he passed. But it was definitely a tragic event for the scene when it happened. It made everyone kind of snap to and realize what Power Trip were doing and how good they were at doing it, I think, outside of it. And I'm just curious to see what will continue to happen to this band's legacy. I'm pretty sure this will be a much heralded release in years to come. Alright, here we go. Another big album. Kind of for like the modern progressive death metal scene. Rivers of Nile. This is Where Owls Know My Name. And I think this one is incredibly important for all of these progressive death metal bands that really are trying to approach it from a wall of sound, like just an intense wall of sound. They'll put a fucking saxophone player in there too. That's become a big thing, and I think you gotta owe it to this album right here. But they'll do an intense wall of sound with just double bass the whole time, and there's just some crazy riffing going on that you almost miss because of how fast the music is going. And then all of a sudden the dynamics just shift, and you're just dumped onto a beautiful, clean part with like, oh, they're playing jazz now. I think that started here, at least in the context of like, modern metal of the 2020s. And I mean, I love Rivers of Nile. I've been following them since, the Conscious Seed of Light. And when this got as big as it did, that was satisfying. And the fact that this actually backs up and warranted the praise makes it all the better. I mean, The Silent Life and A Home are phenomenal opening songs and phenomenal singles that led the album. I mean, I still get both of those songs stuck in my head to this day, But then where the album goes from there, like the journey that it takes you on, makes it so worthwhile. It really feels of death and decay and just stagnation and degradation. I want to highlight the track Death is Real as well. Killer riff on there. But I think these guys made big moves with this album. They're continuing to make big moves with The Work, which came out recently, and they might surpass me on the upcoming album that they're going to release, but I'm still going to be rooting for them. So Rivers of Nile, I think, will be remembered as a classic for years to come. And then, I mean, I hate to say it, this band had to be mentioned. I mean, everyone can roll their eyes or whatever, but I like a couple albums by this band and have also enjoyed their rise to fame. And I think when anyone from the casual hard rock listener currently to even the most extreme metal listener looks back on this decade, they're going to have to be like, Ghost. And I mean, it all started here. This was in combo with Rise Above Records, man. I kind of forgot that. This is Rise Above and Metal Blade put this out, which is surprising considering where they are now. I mean, like, this is a band that is now headlining stadiums, releasing their debut back in 2011, and they're now probably set to be one of the biggest bands in the scene overall, let alone of the decade. And I mean that has to carry over into how fans will end up viewing their music, you know? I mean, we can all argue about like, oh yeah, will prequel be regarded as like a masterpiece, or will Meliora be a classic? But I think people from all walks of the metal sphere can say that this debut is going to be a classic. I mean, Ritual on track 3, Elizabeth track 4, Prime Mover track 8. It's great, and is it a unique sound in the context of the year? Yeah. Is it unique packaging? Yes. I mean, look at this fucking Scooby-Doo mixed with classic horror. it it works, you know. It works. I will not deny the brilliance of Ghost, and the fact that I think we should talk and consider this being a classic band. Like, I can see the year being 2030, 2035, and there's people being like, well, you don't know what it felt like when this album dropped. I believe it will be held with reverence, for sure. Well, there you have it. Those first 4 are my initial attempt to kind of speculate, like the bigger albums that I think the scene will tip their hat to as being classics of the decade. From newer bands too. I'm not even like trying to highlight old bands putting out reunion albums, or you know, like a late career, oh wow, it's okay kind of album. But newer bands with releases. On subsequent videos, I'm going to explore albums and releases that mean a lot more personally to me, but then I also still feel like the scene as a whole will continue to grow around, you know? Because I think, and that's the beauty about this genre of music, a lot of these albums aren't necessarily appreciated right when they come out. You know, they take a couple years. People listen to them, they'll write their year-end list shit about it, and then they'll move on. And then it gets buried. And this is true for like albums that are like number 1 on people's year-end list to number 30 out of 20, you know? But then, like, what albums are people going back to? What albums are people recommending to other metalheads? And what albums are people going to see live from bands? And I think that's what really helps to cement classics. But for now, these 4 albums, I think, are some of the bigger, some of the most well-known from the 2010s, and will be continued to be mentioned for years to come. So, hey, cheers for watching. Drink good beer, listen to good metal.